Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Really excited to go over kinematic sequence today. Sequencing is one of the most important things for effortless velocity and accuracy for quarterbacks. So really wanted to take a deep dive into this today. It was key, the hip-shoulder separation one we went over before. So if you haven't seen that one, I'd highly recommend after this one's done, go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, let's get into it. All right, so here's just a quick recap who I am and what I do. So when I'm speaking to you guys, I'm speaking from a background of I am a healthcare provider, I have my doctorate degree, I have my CSCS. So everything I'm speaking from, I'm trying to ground in science and physics. And if there's anything I don't know, I'm happy to look it up for you guys, but I'm never gonna make this stuff up. I'm just trying to advance the position as a whole from a biomechanics perspective. Okay, so when we talk about sequencing, the kinetic chain comes up a lot. And first off, we're going to talk about what is the kinetic chain. So exactly like it sounds like, when you have a chain, there's links that link different parts together. Anything you do in athletics, and especially throwing, is there's a sequence throughout the kinetic chain. We have a graph over here on the side showing, so legs to trunk to shoulder to elbow to wrist. And you can see how these kind of link together. So basically what we're saying is the whole body works as a kinetic chain from the ground. So it starts in the feet, it works up and all the way out through the hand, through the ball. So it's those links together that forms a whole unit that has to work together in the correct sequence to get effortless velocity. And we'll talk about later, each segment in that chain gets amplified. So it's like an avalanche effect. The better I sequence, the better I utilize my kinetic chain, then the more pop I'm going to get off my hand without really putting a lot of strenuous onto my shoulder or elbow, putting a lot of stress through those joints. Okay, here is the order of the kinematic sequence in the football throw. So foot strike, hip rotation, torso rotation, shoulder rotation, elbow extension, wrist flexion, and follow through. And we'll go over each phase of that. What I wanted to show first is a perfect example here of a quarterback who does a really good job with this. Okay, so this is the one we're going to base kind of everything off of from here on forward. So what we'll see first is start of the kinetic chain, foot strike position, and then we'll see hip rotation, torso rotation, shoulder rotation, elbow extension, wrist flexion, follow through. You can see how that works in kind of this perfect sequence way from the ground up, working all the way through his kinetic chain into one smooth motion that creates a lot of velocity in the football. So let's go ahead and break those down in depth now. Okay, first part of the sequence is the foot strike position or stride step position. So this is when a quarterback gets that front foot into the ground. The goal of this, so we're creating a stable and balanced base and we're initiating ground reaction force. What that means, similar to a sprinter exhibiting force into the ground that then is going to propel them forward, is as a quarterback, I need to be able to generate force into the ground because that's the force that I can then utilize throughout my kinetic chain. So even if you're someone that's doing a great job sequencing, you're really utilizing your kinetic chain well, but you have no ground reaction force, you're very limited in how much velocity you can produce. So this position is very key to get the force going into the ground and then utilize that throughout the rest of the kinetic chain. At this position, you can notice the torso is completely closed like we talked about in our last segment with hip-shoulder separation. Next phase here is going to be hip rotation. So what that's doing is that's taking that ground reaction force that our feet generated into the ground and that's starting to convert it into rotational force. So through the hips, we generate the rotational force. We're moving from the ground up. And then the next phase would be torso rotation. So the hips start rotating, torso then rotates. So my whole mid region here rotates. And that's the key segment that links my lower half to my arm. So that has to rotate really well because that's what links the arm, which is the final piece of the puzzle that's going to get velocity on the football. Next phase is shoulder rotation. So we're looking obviously at layback, but also shoulder internal rotation more so. So hips, torso, and then shoulder goes through. After that, we have elbow extension as I'm hitting out through that elbow extension. So this is transferring energy that was building up from the body out into your arm and into the football in the hand. Wrist flexion, that's where we transfer all that energy that came from the ground up out into the football. And that's usually as we're hitting release, we're flexing and pronating the wrist. And then follow through. This is where we safely dissipate the energy and stabilize the body. So with follow through, you don't want it to be kind of a jerky or rush motion, you need that to safely dissipate all the energy from the kinetic chain, so then your elbow or shoulder don't take the brunt of it. Real quick, we'll go right back through. So we're at foot strike, hip rotation, torso rotation, shoulder rotation, elbow extension, wrist flexion, and follow through. That's the sequence of the chain. Why does this matter? So why is sequencing one of the most important things, and kinetic chain is one of the most important things? So a couple things, and this all goes around the concept of, can I get my body to generate force rather than putting all the stress on my arm? For a couple of reasons is the musculature in my lower half and my hips and my torso is a lot stronger than my shoulder is. So it's going to significantly affect velocity. If I sequence well and I'm generating a lot of force through that chain, then I'm going to get a lot of velocity, and I don't need to rely on the smaller joints like my shoulder and my elbow to generate that velocity. Affects the accuracy. So a lot of people only think about sequencing with velocity, but if I'm sequencing well, usually I'm always getting in the same position on release. So my body's kind of snapping everything into place, so then my arm can just be along for the ride per se. So I'm always getting to that same release point, which is going to get me more consistency and accuracy. And then obviously we're reducing injury risk and we're reducing fatigability. If I let the bigger muscles of my body, so my hips, my torso, and then the lower half generating force into the ground take over the majority of it, then I lose a lot of risk for injuries and fatigability on the smaller joints like the shoulder and the elbow. Okay, let's talk about the difference between joint angle and joint velocity. So what we're looking at here is magnitude of the joint, so visually what we're seeing, and then velocity of the joint. How fast are we moving within that? When it comes to sequencing, velocity is key here. Velocity is really the one we care about. So sequencing is all about how can we transfer energy in the kinetic chain. When we think about energy, velocity is a much bigger indicator of that than magnitude of the joint angle. So what we're using as we think about the quarterback throw is peak rotational velocity within each joint segment. So when the hips are hitting peak rotational velocity, that usually means the hips are generating a significant amount of energy at that one specific phase in the throw. So that gives us a snapshot for which joint is really taking over the role right now within the kinetic chain at that exact snapshot within the throw. And then velocity reveals efficiency within the throw. So the joint angles might look okay. So when I'm visually looking, yeah, it looks like stuff's in order. But if the velocity is all out of whack, then the sequence usually goes out the window and we're not maximizing what we can out of our kinetic chain. Also, the last thing I put here is, so angles are showing position and not timing. So the angle it just shows you where the joint's at in space, but not how fast the joint got there, which is the key thing. How fast can we basically increase the velocity and then decrease the velocity? That's going to make the big difference here. So velocity is king when we're thinking about sequencing. I got another video here. This one's of Jared Goff. Just wanted to showcase a little bit more of the sequencing kind of as we go. So every quarterback's going to be a little bit different in their throw. He does a great job. So we can see foot strike position. You can see in his back leg how he's generating ground reaction force into the ground. And then hips are already starting rotation. So hips are rotating. Although that left hand's a little bit out in front, his torso is still completely closed. So hips rotate, then torso, and then he gets the maximum layback, shoulder rotation, elbow extension, wrist flexion. So you can see it's a synchronized movement from the ground all the way through the hand. All right, let's go back to our slideshow. So here's a graph from the Spin Lab data that I wanted to go over. Stick with me for a little bit. So what we're looking at here is velocity-based graph. So on the left-hand side, we are in degrees per second. And on the bottom here, let me go back. This is a magnitude-based graph. So this is just in degrees. We're looking at the lower half of the throw. I want to focus on hip and torso rotation. So blue line, hip rotation, green line is torso rotation. So when this QB hits peak right about here, this is where the hips are generating most of the force within the kinetic chain. So they hit foot strike position here, and then hips. And then you'll notice torso is kind of directly underneath that peak. So this is someone that really we're getting peak hip and torso at the same time. There's not a good enough delay to transfer that energy along the chain and really get some velocity going through that whole sequence. So they're peaking a little bit early in that torso. Now you can tell when I look at the magnitude down here. So technically this is when you can really visually see rotation start. But really what we care more about is this part right about here, because that corresponds up here to peak. So what I'm trying to visualize with these graphs is although you feel like you can look at a throw and see if a quarterback's sequencing well, you really have no idea until you're looking at the velocity-based graphs. Sure, you can visually see if the joints are in the correct order, but if I don't see where those joint velocities peak, I can't really tell how much of that kinetic chain they're optimizing. Okay, let's talk about peak segment velocity and sequencing. So what I was referring to on the last graph is peak segment velocity is the maximum rotation of a specific body segment. So this is basically how much energy that segment generates during the entire throw. And this is key because we get what we call this proximal to distal whip effect. So proximal meaning more kind of closer to the midline of my body as I'm throwing, and then distal as that hand's getting away from the body. So how I get that whip effect is I'm getting those chain links to peak one after the other, and then all that energy transfers out so then I can snap it off through the hand. Peaking too early, then obviously you're not going to pass energy efficiency like we just talked about. Peak too late, and you don't capitalize on that stored potential energy from the last segment. And then the avalanche effect is that as I get that proximal to distal whip effect, I'm amplifying the downstream velocity. So if I'm really utilizing the full extent of that kinetic chain in that sequencing, then I'm building and I'm amplifying on that velocity. So then that's a quarterback you're thinking, man, they got a huge snap off their hand, but it's really because they're sequencing and really utilizing that kinetic chain. It's not because they're just whipping their arm through at the end. The arm whipping through is a result of the body sequencing properly. Okay, here's a sequencing graph that I got from our data. And once again, we're in degrees per second. The big one I want us to focus on is hip versus torso rotation. So these solid dots right here is when we're hitting peak speeds. This is foot strike. This is maximum external rotation. This is ball release. You can see how this QB, they hit foot strike, and then they hit hip rotation, and then torso rotation, and then elbow extension here is technically after ball release because we're picking up just as the ball is released. So I'm still extending drastically after that ball is initially being let go. So that QB does a great job in their kinetic chain going from ground up, working through the body and then out through the hand. There's a great segment within each. They're not peaking at the exact same time, but it goes in a sequential order. Time delay, so this is the time gap between the peak velocities, what I just talked about. And it's the analogy I use is like you're passing a baton in a relay. So that's the energy transfer, is my hips are going to pass the baton to my torso and then so on and so forth. And just like the avalanche effect we talked about, this magnifies the speed. So if those time delays are correct, that's going to magnify and amplify the speed. If they're too big or too narrow, then we're not going to amplify as much as we can. So here's an example of a good one once again. So there's a good time delay. That's the difference between these solid dots right here with hip and torso, is we're looking at the delay between the two. Here's one I want to show of Tom Brady that you can really see how he does a good job with this delay. So what we're looking at here is hips. So hips are already gone. You can see how the velocity is going in the hips right now, but then there's the delay, then the torso goes. So hips are moving, torso goes. So there's a good delay between the two, which then passes that energy along the kinetic chain and out through the arm. All right, we'll go back here. Poor delays. So like I said, no delay, energy is dissipated, not transferred. Excessive, momentum is not captured. So here is an example of a poor delay here. You can see how hip and torso rotation are directly on top of each other basically. So this QB hits foot strike, and then there's a really long delay here, so nothing's happening. And then basically at the exact same time, energy is going in the hip and torso. So this QB is minimizing the amount of velocity they can get on the throw because they're peaking at the exact same time, rather than getting that avalanche effect. So this one we need hips to go quicker. Torso's probably okay where it's at. If they can just get the hips to go quicker and peak quicker, then they can pass that on to the torso and complete the kinetic chain. Okay, importance of data for sequencing. So like I talked about is, although for a while I thought I could, and a lot of people think, sure, I can look at a quarterback and see if they're sequencing well. Really what you're looking at is the magnitude of the joints in the correct order, which only reveals a tiny fraction of the picture. Really what we're looking at is what are the peak segment velocities? What's the peak energy transfer within that segment, within the specific phase of the throw? And this gets really nuanced with elite athletes. So if you're working with a college or NFL guy and you think, I don't need the sequencing, I can see exactly what they're doing, That's likely because they're extremely talented. So they have really good arm speed and really good arm strength. So it's really hard for you to visually see it just with the naked eye. But then if I were to superimpose their velocity graphs, you can see a lot of breakdowns within the kinetic chain. So just because a quarterback's elite and because you think you're seeing it correctly doesn't mean anything until you see the data. The data shows the true data within that sequence. Are they optimizing their kinetic chain? And just because a quarterback is really good does not mean that they fully optimize the kinetic chain. Sometimes they can overcompensate with the arm. That just means they have so much more room for improvement if they begin to focus on that kinetic chain in the sequencing aspect. Shape of velocity curve. So this can be key. So what we're looking at with the shape of the curve is basically how fast they hit peak speed. So if I get a steep peak, I'm hitting peak speed really fast, and then a steep decline, I'm slowing down really fast. So let's say hip rotation, steep peak, hips are rotating really fast, steep decline, they're slowing down or decelerating really fast, which really helps kind of amplify the sequence within the kinetic chain. That's usually what you want to see. We're gradual, we're slowly going over time, and we're not getting that sharp rise and fall. Sharp rise and fall really passes on energy well within the kinetic chain. So let's look at a couple graphs to kind of hammer this in. Left-hand side over here, here's a great example. Quick peak, and sure, the torso can be a little bit later, but you can see how quick peak, quick decrease, torso, quick peak, slightly delayed after, quick decrease. So we're looking at hips and torso right here. Over here, there's quick peak, but then slow decrease. So poor decel. The hips are really slow to decel, and you can really see in the torso losing a lot of energy and a lot of force in the kinetic chain. So there's a slow climb, slow decline. We don't get that steep peak, so we're really minimizing the amount of force we can transfer out into the arm from the body. Over here, you get some unique stuff sometimes. So like with the torso, the green line, we get pretty sharp peak to start with, and then we kind of get this little delayed action. So the torso is not rotating smoothly. We kind of start to slow down a little bit and then climb back up and then slow down. So over time, you get this big gap here rather than sharp peak, sharp decline. So really training athletes that I need to be able to move really quick and then slow down really quick. So back and forth really quick rather than these gradual progressions. That's how we really utilize the kinetic chain. Okay, sequencing is multiplanar. So this is not something that's a 2D image. This throwing is a very 3D movement. You have to sequence and utilize your kinetic chain in all planes of motion. So both lateral flexion, so right-handed quarterback leaning off to the left, or forward flexion going forward can really impact the efficiency of the sequence in the kinetic chain. Here's a graph down here at the bottom for anyone that's not too familiar with planes of motion. So we have our sagittal plane, which is forward and backwards movement. So that would be like trunk flexion going forward. Transverse plane is rotational movement, so a huge part of the QB throw. And then frontal plane, we're moving left and right. So that would be like lateral flexion off to the side. Aaron Rodgers is a good example here that I'll show in this video on how throwing is a very multiplanar movement. So you can see with him, first off, let's watch his sequence. So foot strike, generating a lot of ground reaction force. You can really see that right leg generating force into the ground. Hips, so hips rotate, torso rotates, arm accelerates through. So nice smooth motion. But then let's watch the planes of motion here. So hips are rotating, so he's in the transverse plane. He's also in the sagittal plane, and he's in the frontal plane as he's working to the left right here. So I'm going in all planes of motion, forward, backwards, rotational, side to side. Throwing is not a simple 2D movement. We have to be able to sequence in all of those planes of motion. Let's go back here. Okay, impact of fatigue on sequencing. So fatigability really showcases a lot of impacts with sequencing. Typically, the main one we see that we talked a lot with hip-shoulder separation is the torso rotates before the same time as the hips, or you get less hip rotation, we start to be all arm. So it's even worse when I'm getting fatigued and putting more stress through the shoulder and the elbow. Here's a good example that I wanted to showcase, and then I'll showcase a couple ones that the QBs can use a little bit work of sequencing just so we can see the difference here. So great sequence. This is at the end of a session. So when QB gets nice and fatigued, you can see how the sequence drives the throw. Foot strike, hips, torso, shoulder, elbow, wrist, follow through. And these are all ones that I'm using on SpinLab data so I can tell when they're hitting peaks. This is not me just guessing with the magnitude of the joints. Another one that you can see here. So here's more fatigability is what I was talking about. So foot strike position now. Torso's already open. Hips are already open. So torso and hips are going at the same time as that foot strike's hitting the ground. So right here, torso is completely open. Now you can see how much stress is going into the shoulder and elbow. So my body's not rotating that energy up through the shoulder, but now we got all that stress going into the elbow as we lay back and follow through. Same thing with this other one is you can see how hip rotation gets really late. So hips don't rotate till now. So at this phase, they're going foot strike. And then this is basically all arm right here. Torso rotates a little bit, but at this position, this is a ton of stress going into the elbow and shoulder at this phase. Hips don't rotate till the end. So we're not generating that force from the ground. We're getting all our energy and all our velocity from the arm, which is not where we want to, especially as we get tired towards the end of a session. Okay, let's skip through these. Sequencing with youth QBs. I wanted to bring this up. So youth QBs, for anyone that works with youth quarterbacks or any youth quarterbacks watching this, they have underdeveloped motor control and mobility. So usually they're going to have suboptimal sequencing. Typically they're hypermobile, but they're not strength through that mobility, so it's not real usable. Common issue is you're gonna get the chest and torso rotating together. Here's my philosophy. Teach sequence. The speed and the strength will come once they hit puberty and they add on muscle. So I'm not really worried about the speed of it, but I want to teach them how to utilize that kinetic chain and that sequencing. So we're teaching them how to generate force from the ground, how to keep the torso closed, let the hips rotate. We're trying to teach them how to take stress off the arm. The elbows are very vulnerable and those growth plates are still open. So the more we can teach these QBs how to sequence properly and how to utilize the kinetic chain, the better their careers and better longevity they're going to have. How to improve sequence. This is all great, but how do we improve it? That's the big thing here. So here's the kind of the progression I like to think about. Identify, isolate, correct, and integrate. So first, I need to identify the breakdown in the sequence. I am looking at where are those peak velocity curves hitting and what is the shape of those velocity curves? Where am I seeing that breakdown? Then I'm going to isolate that specific movement first. So let's say the breakdown is the time delay between the hip and the torso rotation is where the breakdown's happening. I'm going to isolate that. So now we are just working on that delay between the hip and torso. I don't even care about the beginning of the throw or the end of the throw. I'm just isolating that specific transition point and we're working that a lot. Then we're correcting the movement through that and then we integrate it back with the full sequence. So then I go back to the beginning of the throw, the end of the throw. But I want to isolate first and just rep that out and correct that until we put it together as one full cohesive unit there. Common pattern that I'd focus on heavily and why I did hip shoulder separation first is the torso going first or opening at the same time. And that requires all the stuff we talked about 2 weeks ago on how to improve hip shoulder separation. So if a QB's really struggling with that, go back to that stuff. Look how we talked about how do you improve hip shoulder separation first. How to integrate. So build body awareness first is what I say. So this is towel work, mirror work, med ball work, pause and fire drills. So we're getting to certain phases and we're building that awareness within their body of, can I rotate a segment, keep another segment of the chain kind of locked and loaded and ready to go so then I can teach them how to go in a stepwise approach. We're tracking the sequence over time. So I'm seeing what differences is making when they're throwing short, intermediate, deep ball, and then I'm tracking that. What about beginning of a session, end of a session? How about this week as opposed to a couple weeks later? So we're tracking the sequence over time. And then we're integrating into dynamic movement. So once I have somebody that's very good at this, now can I take you off platform? Can I take you through different movements and different planes of motion? Like we talked about, it's 3D planar. So I can see what happens to your sequence. So does your sequence fall apart? Let's say when you're backpedaling to the left, when you're shuffling to the right. Now I need you to be able to sequence well on all different planes of motion. I put 3 drills I really like. So number 1 is what I call a plyo ball rhythm throw. So if I'm a right-handed quarterback, I have a plyo ball in my right hand. I'm going to toss it to my left hand, catch with my left, hand back to my right and throw. So right to left, hand back to right and throw. And what you're feeling is the sequence of as I hand this back, my hips are rotating. So hips rotated. I started that ground reaction first, then hips went. And then because I'm handing it back, I'm keeping the torso closed, which can then utilize that delay between the torso and the hips. Rocking throws. So literally have QBs rock back and forth. It's hard to do when I'm sitting here, but rock back and forth with their feet. And then they focus on once that left foot, or if you're a right-handed quarterback, once your left foot hits the ground, how quickly can I turn my back foot and my back hip? So that's really working on the speed of hip rotation. So I'm here, land, boom, hip goes, then rest of the throw falls. And then pull to external rotation throws. So this is working that phase of transferring from ground reaction force to hip rotation while keeping torso closed. So I'm at the end of my pull. My left foot or my stride step's already in the ground, and then I'm focusing on, as I'm externally rotating and laying back, can I keep my torso closed as my hips go? So I'm going to start from here at the throw, and then I'm going to go full speed. And the very next thing I'm focusing on is, as I externally rotate, can I quickly rotate that hip while keeping my chest closed? Those are a couple of the main ones I really like to focus on, but big thing is first you got to identify and you got to isolate that movement first to really help improve it. Okay, that is all I have for these. Now we're going to go ahead and open this up to questions. Anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer anything as we go. All right, let me pull up. So we had some that came in before the webinar. First one was favorite drills for sequencing. So I went over a couple of them there. The big thing is, the big sequencing breakdown with quarterbacks is the hip rotation versus torso rotation. Usually the arm kind of falls into place if you can get those two things correctly. So other ones that I like besides the one we went over, I like jumping throws a lot. So that's literally where you jump, land, and drive your throw. The point of that, couple things. So as I land, can I generate ground reaction force? And then can I get the hips going extremely quick while the torso stays closed? So it's a tough position to be in. You got to generate force quickly and you got to rotate quickly while keeping your chest closed. Other one I like that we talked about, the hip shoulder separation, is slow pull to fast finish. So basically I'm slow through the pull phase, torso is completely closed as the back hip rotates. So I'm just teaching the QB how to get in that position where the hips are rotated and the torso and chest is staying completely closed. I got another one here. Let's see. What improvements do you see when a QB improves their sequence? Number one, or a couple things, but biggest thing I see is jump in velocity. So if a QB improves the sequence, you're going to see a significant jump in velocity and power on the throw, and it should feel a lot less effort. So it should feel effortless for the QB if they improve the sequence. And then the other thing is it makes them whippy. So when we think about sequence, hip shoulder separation, and scap load that we haven't talked about yet, those are the keys for what makes a whippy throw. That's kind of the common ones I see. Okay, then I'm gonna go to the chat now. So does sequencing change for youth QBs? Yes, like we talked about, sequencing is, it's very difficult for youth quarterbacks to understand, but it's really important just to start to teach them how to optimize that kinetic chain. It's not gonna be perfect, but the better you can do it from that perspective once they hit puberty, a lot easier it's going to be once they get the musculature to support the sequence. What drill can you do to get better at mobility throws? If we're talking in terms of mobility, like just strict mobility in the shoulder and stuff, then a lot of that is going to be plyo ball related. I will have a completely separate webinar on scap loading. That's going to be a big one in terms of how to get the arm loose and get mobile through the throws. If there's other ones specifically, though, I can always address that. But if it's more general mobility kind of throughout the sequence and everything, a lot of that, the part we haven't touched on yet is scap loading that I'll go over in a whole separate segment. Have you seen athletes struggle to sequence properly when trying to generate a lot of ground reaction force? Yes, significantly. Is a lot of QBs and athletes don't understand truly what ground reaction force is. So a lot are literally just popping up on their toes. And if you pop up real aggressively like that, you kind of shoot up the hips and there's no rotation going on. So the sequence get completely thrown off. So it's a matter of, I like to find the middle ground. There's the camp of QB coaches who think that you sit, you keep your weight back in your back foot, you sit and you pivot. And then the other ones that think you shift your weight real hard. Really what the physics shows is there's going to be some sort of linear force production as you're taking your stride step. The key conversion is, can you convert that linear to rotational once the stride step hits the ground? So it's a matter of making sure guys aren't popping straight up, but also aren't just completely sitting back, because if you do that, you're losing a lot of force production capabilities. Those are kind of the big ones I see. And then going off on that, just a little tangent with that is, if it's a quarterback who doesn't have the power, then ground reaction force is going to be difficult in general. So if you're doing everything correctly and the ground reaction force is still not there, that's half the time is just a strength and power issue, and they need to hit the weight room to address that. Okay. I'll give it a couple minutes if there's any other questions on sequencing or anything related that I'm happy to address. And And then also going off that ground reaction force question is I'll focus on the sequence first, then add the ground reaction force later. And trying to do it together sometimes can be tough. So as long as the sequence is good, typically the ground reaction force will come. This one I found success with teaching get the stride foot in the ground as quick as possible to help with the ground reaction force sequencing. Does the data back that up? 100%. Our best sequence throwers can get the front foot in the ground firmly and quickly. And the physics supports it too, so rotation cannot truly begin until that front foot gets in the ground. So if you're striding and getting in the ground quickly, then that's when you can start rotation. Guys that take forever to get the front foot in the ground and they're already kind of in their layback position, is the sequencing's out the window, and there's so much stress on their arm, and there's no rotation going through the torso and hips. So 100%, data completely supports it, physics supports it, is the quicker the QB can get that foot strike in the ground, better it is for sequencing and better for everything else downstream. All right, any other questions? And let me check, make sure I didn't miss any that came in beforehand. Oh, I got one here. What injuries do you see being reduced with proper sequencing? A couple of the big ones. So injuries, this is me from a healthcare perspective now, is I don't like to attribute it to one specific thing. But I think there's a common thread with any elbow and shoulder injury is that there's underutilization of the kinetic chain and of sequencing. There's always improvements the thrower can make on that. When you think about when the chest flies open early, you're in a very vulnerable position where now I'm yanking my arm into the throw, and there's so much stress that goes across that medial side of the elbow. So a lot of it is not necessarily that if I perfect the sequencing, there's no injuries that are going to happen, but usually when you see an injury, the quarterback's not as efficient as they can be with the sequencing and the kinetic chain. Can you explain extension? I struggle to explain it and teach it. Yeah, so extension is how I teach it. So literally we're talking about elbow extension. So as I'm going through in my throw, my slot can vary, but elbow extension is how much extension I can get out towards the target. How I personally teach it, the cue I use is like you're trying to throw your hand through the receiver's chest. So as I'm accelerating through, I'm trying to extend out, touch the receiver in the chest. I could care less afterwards if the arm pulls across or if it goes straight down, as long as they're decelling properly and they have a good follow through and they're not just kind of yanking the arm afterwards. But basically I'm trying to see, can I get full extension out? The big thing with extension is if you want to improve on extension, a lot of times slot throws help with that, meaning you have guys lower their slot, which is really kind of moving in the spine. If you have guys do that, then a lot of times it helps them feel that extension, because once you lower the slot, a lot of it relies on layback and extension for velocity. So that's the big thing that I'm looking at with that. The other thing is you could cue it to death with QBs and they're still not getting full extension. If that's the case, it's most likely a muscular issue. So if you have poor external rotators in your shoulder, those are your brakes for the throw. So as I'm accelerating forward, my body's only going to extend as well as it can handle. So if my external rotators are weak, I'm not going to fully let it go. I'm going to kind of stop short. So that's a big indicator that if you're cueing it well and the QB still can't get in, they're still short arming it, they're usually really weak in the external rotators of the shoulder, and especially weak through eccentric load. Any drills for training deceleration? Yes, there's a decent amount of them that I do, and it depends on the specific phase of deceleration that they're struggling with. I'll give kind of one key one that I look for automatically is the front side leg. So I look at the ankle joint and the angle of the foot. If they're not stepping off midline and if those toes aren't slightly closed, then decel is going to be poor. So making sure if the QB opens the toes all the way to the target, decel is going to be poor almost every single time unless they have phenomenal body control. So the angle of the toes helps support that. And then I use line throws. So I'm using a line to have them keep those angles of the toes closed so it helps decel the hips properly. And then the front knee. So if the front knee, this is a big difference with pitching. So you'll hear a lot of people in the baseball space that disagree with this. It's a huge difference with quarterbacks and pitching is in quarterbacks, you want to keep stability in the front knee, meaning I want to maintain somewhat of that flexion in the front knee. That allows me to finish off the rotation. Pitchers extend really hard in the front knee because they're throwing downhill on a mound, so they're getting their torso forward flexion really significant. Quarterbacks, we don't want to flex forward because we're utilizing more extension. We're throwing on a level plane, and I can't lock out my front knee because if I get hit, that's a significant injury if my front knee is locked out. So kind of the big things I look at with deceleration right off the bat is where's their stride step relative to midline, how are the angle of the toes, and what's going on with the front knee. If any of that's off, there's really no drills that's going to support it. But if you can kind of hammer those things in, a lot of decel kind of falls into place. And usually what I'll have guys do is 2 hands on the ball, take your stride step, pause, let me make sure it's all correct so the angle of the toes looks good, stride step's off midline, there's good flexion in the front knee, and then I'm just going to cue them from that point forward is finish off the throw full go. I just want as little of movement through that front leg as possible. So the backside's rotating really aggressively and I'm snapping off the throw, but I'm maintaining really good front leg stability. And I'll try to do a completely separate one on acceleration and deceleration so we can go over that in depth. Okay. I think that might be all the time we have for questions on this round. If you guys have anything that comes up afterwards, let me know and I'll try to address them in the future webinars. Thank you so much though. Really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to doing more of these. So if you guys have any suggestions, any stuff you're struggling with, let me know and I'll see if I can incorporate it into future webinars.